They say every city is built upon something: stone, earth, or the bones of forgotten empires. But this city's foundation was different. It was a promise, a covenant so old, no one remembered its first witness, yet every citizen still lived beneath its silent weight. The streets glittered with commerce. Music drifted from balconies and fountains sang in every square. But once a year a hush fell over the avenues, as if the city itself drew a single breath. On that night, the grand archway older than the city, older perhaps than the river, would open, and someone would walk through. No one ever returned, yet the next morning the air would be sweeter, the river gentler, and the markets more prosperous than before. It was never called by the grim names of other lands. Here they simply called it the Passage. No decree announced who would make the journey. Some claimed it was chosen by the Council of Vales, others that the city itself decided. Faces would vanish from familiar places, and in their absence, the city thrived. Outsiders speculated, but the citizens only said, "The year turns and so must we." For them, the passage was not loss, it was renewal. The old woman sat on a stone bench in the market square, watching life spin around her like a potter's wheel. She'd seen many turnings since she first came to this city as a young bride, many passages. Her husband, bless his soul, had been one of the chosen. She remembered the day he'd vanished through the archway, his eyes shining with an unearthly light, his steps sure and strong despite the tremor in her heart. At the time, she'd been afraid, for who wouldn't be? But now, as she watched the children chasing pigeons in the square, she knew her fear had been for nothing. The city had renewed itself, as it did every year, and her Thomas had been part of that. Across the square, a young man with eyes as green as the river at spring flood watched the pigeons with equal fascination. His name was Finn, son of Aaron and Torin, born and bred in this city. He'd heard the stories, of course, and felt the city's breath held every year on the night of the turning, but until now, it had always seemed like a tale to scare children into obedience. He'd scoffed at the elders' fears and made merry with his companions. But tonight, as he walked home through the silent lamplit streets, the old archway seeming to beckon him, he understood. This city was built on sacrifice. Its very prosperity was bought with lives. He reached his house, a modest dwelling with honeysuckle climbing up its white walls. He went inside, found his mother in the kitchen, and told her what he'd realized. His mother was older than most of the women in the city, but she moved with the grace of someone half her years. She listened to him with a faraway look in her eyes, and when he was done, she nodded slowly. "You feel the calling then?" she said. "Do I?" he asked, surprised. She smiled sadly. "Every child of this city feels the calling, Finn. It's in our blood, in our very bones. We are the descendants of the bargain, and the bargain demands its due." He stared at the worn tablecloth, at the chipped cups on the cupboard, trying to understand. "So who goes through the archway?" "Those the city needs," she said, "and that could mean anyone. It could be the baker whose bread feeds the children, the cobbler whose shoes keep the old from harm, or a young man who stands on the ramparts all day, watching for trouble on the horizon." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a strange light. "When the city calls, there is no refusing the call. Finn, if you hear the song of the archway, you must go to it. If it takes you, there is no turning back." As the first tendrils of dawn crept over the horizon, Finn stood on the battlements, staring out at the river. In the distance, he could hear the faint strains of music, and it seemed to pull at him, urging him forward, beckoning him to come. He did not know if he was hearing the song in his head or if it was carried on the wind, but he knew he had to go to the archway. When the city called, the answer was already on its way. I don't know if you know this about yourself, but I feel like a lot of the stories I like are always kind of like half memories. Like half memories of stories I've heard before but never quite finished. So here's one that fits that vibe. I hope you enjoyed. Long before the towers and marble arcades, our settlement lay beside a restless river. The elders spoke of a shadow in its depths, neither menace nor friend, that appeared with the spring floods. The people called it the Hunger, and every year they made an offering to it, a girl from each family, the youngest, most favored daughter. But the hunger took more than daughters. It took whole settlements, sometimes entire villages that were never seen again. In one season, a traveler came to us who had seen much of the world. He said he'd heard of our hunger and scoffed. "Why do you cower before a myth? Come, I'll show you there is no beast beneath the waves." He walked out into the river where the water swirled deepest and the mist hung heaviest. We watched as he vanished into the churning water and the mist swallowed him whole. When it cleared, he was gone. By evening, the air was scented with blossoms and the harvest that followed was more bountiful than any before. The people began to whisper. Perhaps the shadow had accepted a gift. We found a stone the next day where the traveler had stood. It was warm to the touch and etched with a single symbol unlike any we knew. In time, our settlement became a thriving city, but the ritual endured. Every year on the day the mist swallowed the traveler, we chose a girl to walk through the lamplit streets to the ancient archway that marked the river's edge. She would be veiled, silent. None knew the method of selection. It was as if the city's breath itself pointed the way. The archway's stones were impossibly smooth, carved with glyphs in no known tongue. Scholars claimed the symbols shifted when unobserved. We did not ask questions. We only knew the fountains would flow, the granaries would fill, and the lanterns would be lit again next year. The tradition continued until the empire came. A young empress, barely a woman, took the throne after her father died in battle. Her uncle tried then to end the custom, to make the river a part of the empire's busy thoroughfare. He failed because no one could touch the archway. To approach its stones was as much an instinct as fear, as primal as hunger. Those who tried were driven mad by unseen hands and voices. So the empress came herself, cloaked and hooded. As she passed through the archway, the city's foundations trembled, and the river roared its approval. Inside the archway, the riverbed was dry and cracked. In the center sat a single lotus blossom, white as bone. The empress picked it up and placed it in the palm of her gloved hand. Then the ground split open beneath her feet and the river surged upward, swirling around her ankles, pulling at her skirts. She smiled beneath her hood, baring teeth as sharp and white as the blossom in her hand. When the water receded, she stood triumphant, the blossom crushed to a dark paste between her fingers. From her robes 1,000 eyes glittered, watching, waiting. The empress raised her arms and the river roared its approval once more, thundering a hymn to its new mistress. The city's people cheered, for the river was theirs once more, as were the fields and the flocks. As was the sky filled with birds, all given by the hunger, taken by the arch. And the empress, her face still hidden, walked back through the archway, hand raised high, the crushed blossom held before her like a scepter. She was one of us now, and we would follow her, we, the children of the arch. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Let me know what you thought of it down below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and consider supporting me for early access to more content just like this. This city was a furnace of splendor, drawing strangers from far horizons. Among them came Darian, a chronicler by trade, a student of architecture by avocation. Yet he found himself tracing the path of the archway as processions more than the palaces and public works that adorned the skyline. He walked the route every day, his fingers trailing the worn stones beneath his feet, stones that had been smoothed by centuries of passage. One afternoon, he heard a saffron seller humming a tune. Her voice was like the chiming of bells, and the words echoed in his mind, long after her stall had disappeared from view. The step that binds the year. When he asked one of the city elders about it, her eyes clouded over. Some doors, she murmured, do not open for strangers. That night, Darian circled the archway, counting its steps, tracing their pattern, memorizing their number. As the last vestige of daylight faded, he saw the shadow of the archway fall in a direction it should not. He rushed toward it, stumbling between the stones until he felt the reassuring solidity of one beneath his hand. It was warm, not uncomfortably so, just pleasantly, invitingly warm. And there, nestled in the seam between two of the stones, he found a shard of obsidian, smooth and warm to the touch. From then, the ritual consumed him. Every night he returned to the archway, pressing the obsidian shard into the warm stone. Feeling its energy thrumming beneath his fingertips, he learned that the Council of Vales had 7 members, though no records existed of their names or faces. They appeared only at certain festivals, cloaked figures whose presence was more felt than seen. Rumor had it they ensured the city's fortune would remain sealed within the walls of the great archway. When spring came, turning the city into a riot of color, Darian joined the throngs heading toward the archway. The figure emerged, a tall, slender silhouette framed by the blaze of light behind. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Then, as the figure reached the second step, it paused, turned and looked directly at him. It wasn't a long gaze, maybe a heartbeat in duration, yet it felt like an eternity to Darian. His knees trembled, his breath caught in his throat. It was like a tether had been forged between them, invisible yet unbreakable. The figure descended another step, then raised a gloved hand. Beckoning, time resumed its ceaseless march. The crowd surged forward, their murmurs swelling into cheers as the veiled figure continued down the steps. Though the procession had moved on, Darian remained rooted to the spot, the echo of the saffron seller's song resonating in his ears. The step that binds the year. What did it mean? What did it have to do with him? The questions tumbled through his mind, unanswered. As he stared at the place where the figure had stood, he returned to the archway every day, drawn by an invisible force. But the figure in blue didn't appear, nor did any of the Council of Vales. He stood at the foot of the archway, his gaze tracing the path of its steps, now a stark reminder of the impossible. Then one evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he noticed something. The figure in blue was back. Darian's heart stuttered. Hope surged through him, mingling with trepidation. What would happen if the figure recognized him? Would it bring him closer to the secrets of the city or hasten his demise? He watched as the figure approached the archway, each step deliberate, purposeful. As it mounted the steps, a sense of foreboding washed over him. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. He wanted to flee, yet his feet were rooted to the ground. At the top of the archway, the figure paused, turning to face him. Its gaze, even from this distance, was intense, unwavering. In that instant, Darien felt exposed, his facade of composure crumbling. Fear threatened to overwhelm him, but he held his ground. As the figure began its descent, Darien felt a strange calm settle over him. It was as if the figure's mere presence had dispelled the shadows in his heart. He watched, mesmerized, as it approached. Each step brought it closer, and with each step, the weight of the obsidian shard in his pocket grew heavier. When it reached the bottom of the archway, it stopped, fixing its gaze on him. Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city. Finally, the figure spoke, its voice surprisingly gentle. "You have come a long way, haven't you?" it said, its tone devoid of judgment. Darien, startled by the unexpected kindness in its voice, managed a shaky nod. The figure's gaze softened, and it gestured toward the archway. "Come," it said. "There are things you need to see." The weeks before the next passage, Darien felt the city closing in. The air was heavier. Conversations hushed when he passed. He tried to tell himself it was just the pre-passage jitters, the fear of the unknown that made the people of Iria so skittish. But even the birds in the elven trees had fallen silent. He walked the streets aimlessly, coming to rest at the base of the great archway that led to the Blighted Lands. It had been 2 years since he'd fled through this archway. 2 years since he'd carried something out of Aria that didn't belong there. 2 years of hiding. When he'd fled, he'd sworn never to return. Yet now he found himself drawn back to the place he'd escaped from. When he touched the arch, cool glyphs traced patterns across his fingertips. He traced them, memorizing their shapes. Then he pulled away, startled by the sudden movement. From the corner of his eye, he'd seen the glyphs curl into new shapes, spirals, rivers, unseen constellations. But when he looked again, the glyphs were still and unmoving. What was happening? Was the stress of the passage affecting his mind? Was that why everyone was acting so strangely? The thought brought a scoff to his lips. The passage was nothing to fear. Sure, every year some people went missing after crossing the archway, but no one had ever come back and spoken of the Blighted Lands with anything other than reverence. They spoke of healing springs and tranquil forests, of seeing the great stag and hearing the song of the earth. And though Darien had only seen twisted thorns and heard the rustle of decay, he knew better than to speak his truth. Now, as if emerging from the shadows themselves, a veiled woman stood before him. Her dark hair was bound with silver, her form slender and graceful. She inclined her head, and Darien saw that her eyes shone with an inner light. "You carry something that belongs here," she said, her voice like the chime of a distant bell. Her gaze fell to his pocket, and he instinctively closed his hand around the shard of obsidian he always carried there. The stone was cold, smooth, a perfect fit for the space between his thumb and forefinger. It was also useless, a worthless piece of glass. Or was it? Had you entered, the elders of Auria said that the blight could be stopped if they had something from the other side of the archway. That was why he'd taken the shard, not knowing how or if it would help. But now, looking into the veiled woman's knowing eyes, he understood. This was no ordinary object. This was a key. "Return it before the bells," the woman said, "or the river will remember." The words echoed in his mind long after she disappeared back into the shadows. The river will remember. What did that mean? As the days passed, the question echoed in his thoughts, growing louder, more insistent. Then one evening, he remembered the stories the old wood sprites used to tell about the heart of Iria. The river that flowed through the city, a river that held the memory of the city itself. Could that be true? Could the river hold memories of everything that had ever happened within its banks? If so, then what did it know? And how would the river make him pay if he didn't return the shard? Darien knew he had to act. Now the thought of fleeing back into the Blighted Lands filled him with dread. Yet he owed it to the people of Iria to try. Perhaps if he could find someone on the other side who understood the blight, they could work together to stop it. Surely there was more to the shard than met the eye. That night, he slipped out of his house and toward the archway. The closer he got, the more the glyphs called to him, beckoning, promising. As if to prove his point, the glyphs flared to life, tracing patterns in the air above the archway. Rivers flowed, leaves turned, and a great stag lowered its head to drink. At the same moment, the veiled woman emerged from the arch. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and Darien felt a jolt shoot through him. She turned, and without another word, began to walk through the archway. The crowd of people waiting to pass had vanished. Now the path was clear. Taking a deep breath, Darien stepped forward, the scent of river mist surrounding him, the threshold calling. When dusk fell over the city, Darien found himself drawn to the archway, its shadow a beckoning hand against the dying light. Each step toward it felt heavier than the last, as if the cobblestones themselves were reluctant to let him pass. Yet there was no turning back. Not for the first time, he thought of the stories whispered in taverns, of the archway's power to test a man's resolve, to strip away pretense and reveal the core of his being. Some said it was a portal to the underworld, a gateway to a realm where one's deepest fears and regrets were made manifest. Others claimed it was a nexus of ancient magic, a place where the veil between worlds was thinnest and the whispers of forgotten gods echoed in the twilight. But Darien had come with a heavy heart and a hollow purpose. Nothing, he thought bitterly, would test his resolve more than the ghost of his own past. As he reached out to touch the cool stone of the arch, the figure emerged from the shadows, its form coalescing like mist before the rising sun. Darian recoiled, startled, and the figure gestured patiently for him to go on, its eyes pools of fathomless understanding. Taking a deep breath, he stepped within. The air on the other side was still and heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth and distant rain. Before him lay a courtyard, the very stones seeming to gleam as if wet, and at its center stood an ornately carved fountain, its basin filled with what looked like liquid obsidian. But it was the markings on the stones that truly caught Darian's attention. Etched into them were living currents, writhing and turning, as if the very essence of the archway was trying to communicate with him. It was then that he saw the figure standing before the fountain, its form outlined against the shimmering water, and as he watched, mesmerized, it dipped a finger into the obsidian and traced a symbol on the palm of its hand. In that instant, Darian felt a jolt of recognition, as if some long-dormant part of his soul was stirring. He crossed the courtyard, each step feeling strangely suspended, and the sound of his own footsteps seemed to echo in his ears. Time itself seemed to slow, the world beyond the archway fading into a distant hum. The figure turned, its face obscured by the shadows of the hood, and held out a hand. Looking into the fathomless depths of its eyes, Darian saw not his own reflection, but the city inverted, as if seen from beneath the river's surface. In that moment, everything he had endured, every sacrifice, every loss, every bitter twist of fate, it all made sense. This was not an ending, he realized, but an integration. Those who stepped through the archway did not vanish, they became the city's strength. The clarity of its fountains, the fragrance of its orchards, the steadfastness of its walls. They became the very breath of the city. With newfound clarity, Darian reached out and touched the figure's arm, feeling the warmth of its living presence beneath his fingertips. The figure stepped aside, and Darian, guided by an unseen hand, approached the fountain. Gazing into its depths, he saw not his own face, but a swirling vortex of silver light, and from its depths, he felt a gentle pull, a beckoning toward something vast and eternal. With a final glance at the courtyard, he stepped into the light. The shard in his pocket, which had been nothing but a burden and a reminder of his pain, suddenly dissolved into a million glittering sparks. Its weight was replaced by the steady pulse of the city, its joys and sorrows, its hopes and dreams. All around him, the streets teemed with life, laughter echoing in the twilight. And yet in the midst of it all, there was a new, unseen presence watching, listening, a part of the eternal covenant. Then, as the bells of the clock tower chimed, signaling the coming night, Darian knew he was no longer alone, for in that hallowed space between worlds, he had become the city's silent guardian, bound to protect its fragile peace. A smile touched his lips as he walked into the gathering dusk. If you ever find yourself drawn to the archway when the sun dips below the horizon, he thought, you might feel my presence in the rustle of leaves or the whisper of the wind. If you listen closely, you might just hear the echoes of our shared humanity resonating through the ages, and should you choose to step through, you will understand.